Under the orange haze of a dying bonfire, Marla Jensen stood with her arms crossed, jacket zipped up to her chin. The October air was sharp that night, dry and biting. The birthday party had thinned out. A few classmates still lingered by the fire pit, laughing too loudly, but Marla had already texted her mom that she was heading out. It wasn't the first time she'd taken the shortcut behind Whitaker Cemetery to get home. It shaved nearly 10 minutes off her walk, and she'd done it in daylight and dusk more times than anyone could count. People in their small Indiana town didn't fear the cemetery. It was old, sure, a little overgrown, but it was just part of the landscape. Just another quiet place with rusted fences and names no one remembered. Marla turned down the narrow trail behind the farmhouse fence, flashlight on her phone flickering as she stepped through dry leaves. Her sneakers brushed gravel as she made her way down toward the cemetery's north entrance, where the old Whitaker gates stood half-hinged and crooked. She passed under them a little after 10:15 p.m., her silhouette briefly visible to a neighbor sitting on a front porch across the field. He would later say she looked calm, normal, maybe even humming to herself. But what happened after that, no one could say. The next morning, when Mrs. Jensen knocked on Marla's door and got no reply, she assumed her daughter was still sleeping. But the bed was untouched, the blanket smoothed out like it had never been used. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall. Her school backpack leaned against the desk, and the sliding door to the back porch, the one she always locked before sleeping, was still unlatched. That was the first thing that made her pause. The second was the silence. Marla always left her radio on low overnight, tuned to some sleepy rock station. That morning, the room was dead quiet. She called Marla's friends. None had heard from her since the party. One said she left early. Another said she didn't seem upset, just tired. By 9:30 a.m., Mrs. Ka Jensen had called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived within the hour, took her statement, and began canvassing the area. It wasn't until a neighbor came forward around noon that investigators got their first and last confirmed sighting. He told them he'd seen Marla walking past the Whitaker gates the night before, headed down into the woods behind the cemetery. She didn't look distressed. She wasn't with anyone. She was alone. By 3 p.m., a full search had begun. K-9 units were brought in, and volunteers combed the woods, ditches, and farm fields nearby. The cemetery itself, with its scattered headstones and crumbling crypts, was checked from end to end. Nothing, no shoe prints, no phone, no signs of a struggle. The dogs picked up a partial scent near the far edge of the graveyard, but it led nowhere. Authorities believed she likely made it past the cemetery into the back trail that fed toward an old service road, but no one had seen her beyond that. She had, it seemed, vanished in that brief window of distance between the gates and the trees. News spread quickly. The local paper ran the story with a black and white photo of Marla from her school ID, eyes wide and slightly off camera, lips pressed in a hesitant smile. Search teams expanded their perimeter, draining culverts and scouring every farm shed and hunting blind in a 5-mile radius, but no jacket, no phone, no body, not even a torn scrap of fabric. Her classmates organized a vigil within 3 days. Candles lined the edge of the cemetery fence, and her best friend left a stuffed rabbit tied to the gate with ribbon. Teachers described her as bright and independent. Her mother, who rarely spoke to the press, issued a quiet plea on local TV asking her daughter to come home. She never believed Marla had run away. Not without her music, not without her sketchbooks, not without saying goodbye. Police checked nearby offenders, old town rumors, and distant relatives. Marla had no boyfriend, no enemies. She was saving up for college. Her online history showed nothing out of the ordinary. Investigators were left with a string of what-ifs. What if she tripped? What if she got picked up? What if she got lost? As days passed, then weeks, the community's hope thinned. Posters faded. The stuffed rabbit grew gray with rain. Her mother kept the porch light on through winter. The cemetery gates, once just a shortcut, became something else entirely, a border between what was known and what wasn't. A line Marla had crossed, alone, into the dark, and 18 years later, when police would return to those same gates, when what lay sealed behind stone was finally uncovered, they would realize how close she had always been. By the second day, the search had expanded well beyond the cemetery, Deputies, forest rangers, and dozens of volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder in the woods, calling Marla's name. The air was damp with the kind of fog that clings low to the ground, swallowing sound. By late afternoon, a cadaver dog stiffened near the northwest crypts, low stone structures set into the rise of a hill with rusted gates and half-collapsed doors. The dog circled one of them twice, nose to the ground, then let out a low whine. The handler called it in. Officers marked the spot and pulled back brush from the entrance. It was old, broken in places, barely more than a shallow room of stone shelves and flaking moss. Nothing inside looked fresh, no trace of fabric, no signs of struggle. The dog was brought back in. This time, it sniffed the threshold, then backed away. That single hit, the dog alerting at that one crumbling crypt, would fuel years of speculation. At the time, investigators couldn't confirm whether the scent was human or animal. The area was muddy and heavy with mold, and no secondary trail was found leading in or out. Still, they logged the site and returned twice over the next week, checking the soil, brushing through debris, and even boring into a nearby patch of collapsed ground. But they found nothing. It was recorded as a weak lead, then quietly shelved. In town, the tone had shifted. People stopped calling it a runaway. Instead, whispers crept in, theories, stories about what might have happened inside those gates. One resident claimed there were old tunnels beneath the cemetery from the Darnell family who once owned the land. Another said there were sealed vaults no one had opened in decades. None of it was verified. But every new idea brought more people to the site. First, it was bloggers, then amateur sleuths with metal detectors, then full groups of online mystery forums coordinating meetups at Whitaker Cemetery. By November, the graveyard had become a curiosity, not a crime scene. Police tried to manage it. Signs were posted. Patrols were increased. But the damage was done. Any usable ground had been trampled. The scent trails, if they ever existed, were now overwritten by hundreds of footprints and cigarette butts. Crypt doors had been forced open, some spray-painted, some littered with trash. Whatever clues may have once lingered near those graves were gone. Meanwhile, the official investigation slowed. Detectives re-interviewed her classmates. They tracked down 2 separate truck drivers who passed through the area that night, but dash cams showed nothing. Security cameras at the only gas station in range hadn't been recording. The system had crashed days earlier. Her phone remained off. Her bank account is untouched. No evidence of online planning, no hints of a secret trip. Police searched computers, social media, and diaries. Nothing. The local paper ran a new article each week, at first with urgency, then with speculation, then finally with resignation. When asked on camera if she believed Marla was still alive, her mother paused for nearly 10 seconds before whispering, "I don't know anymore." As the weeks stretched into months, the case thinned. Leads dried up. Witnesses repeated themselves. The neighbor who saw her at the gate began second-guessing the time. One volunteer, who claimed to find a red thread near the base of the cemetery fence, admitted later he'd brought it with him. The timeline blurred. The edges of truth began to fray. By January, the case was classified as suspended. Not closed, not yet, but frozen in place. No further evidence, nobody, no clear crime. Only a girl who stepped through a rusted gate and never returned. The Jensen family held a private gathering at their home on what would have been Marla's 18th birthday. Her bedroom was left unchanged. Her drawings remained pinned to the corkboard above her desk. Her jacket, the one she wore that night, still hung by the back door. Her mother said she could still smell her shampoo on the pillowcase, but she didn't go into the room anymore. Not after Christmas. The community, shaken and unsure how to grieve something so unresolved, quietly moved on. Flyers came down. The cemetery, once again, grew quiet. But the legend never faded. Years later, new tenants moving into homes nearby would hear the story for the first time, about the girl who vanished behind the gates, about the crypt the dogs reacted to, about the rumors of tunnels and rooms sealed long ago. And no one, not even the detectives, could explain how, in a place so old and so still, the earth could swallow someone completely. Not until nearly 2 decades later, when the truth finally surfaced, not above ground, but beneath it. Whitaker Cemetery had always been there, as far as anyone could remember, a quiet patch of sloped earth lined with crumbling headstones and crooked trees. To most in town, it was just a part of the backdrop, the kind of place you drove past on your way to the post office or the hardware store. But after Marla Jensen's disappearance, interest in the cemetery shifted from passive to obsessive. Locals who once ignored it began to speculate about it. Paranormal groups began showing up, even out-of-town history buffs got involved, and eventually, someone who knew its origins decided to speak up. Martin Keene had spent 40 years cataloging local history, running the town's museum out of an old converted church basement. He wasn't the kind of man people usually listen to, too quiet, too absorbed in archives. But when reporters reached out to ask about the cemetery, he didn't hesitate. In a recorded interview, he said, "Whitaker Cemetery wasn't the town's first. It was actually built on top of something older, a private burial ground from the 1800s that had belonged to the Darnell family, one of the area's earliest settlers. Back then, landowners often buried their own dead on their property, and the Darnells had a small crypt system built into the hillside behind their homestead. Those original structures, Martin claimed, were still there. Buried beneath newer additions, sealed and forgotten, he pulled out maps to prove it, faded blueprints from the 1870s, surveyor notes from 1923, and then one document that hadn't seen daylight in nearly a century, a maintenance report from 1935 referencing fire damage to the cemetery's northwest quadrant and the emergency closure of 3 lower vaults described as unstable and hazardous. The vaults were to be bricked over and recorded as permanently inaccessible. No follow-up was ever filed. The fire itself was barely remembered, just a brief mention in the local paper. Brush fire caught on dry headstones, no casualties, minimal damage. But Martin believed it had caused more destruction than anyone had realized. And worse, he believed those bricked-over vaults were never documented on modern maps. When the town later expanded the cemetery, they had done so over unstable ground, completely unaware of the sealed chambers below. As news of Martin's findings spread, conspiracy theorists and amateur sleuths latched onto the idea. The missing girl, the fire, the sealed vaults. For some, it became proof that Marla had somehow stumbled into one of those hidden places, maybe through a sinkhole, maybe through a forgotten tunnel. A few even claimed the crypt where the cadaver dog had alerted sat dangerously close to where the original Darnell vaults would have been, had the old map been accurate. The theory gained traction online, especially in true crime forums, where users debated the accuracy of Martin's documents and called for excavation. But the official response remained cautious. The sheriff's department reviewed the maps, but dismissed them as inconclusive. No geological scans were ordered. The city cited safety concerns and historic preservation laws. Digging up 150-year-old ground without a confirmed lead, they said, would be reckless. As the years went on, interest in the theory faded, but it never disappeared completely. The whispers remained. There was one more detail that Martin shared, though it received less attention. In a handwritten letter from 1936, folded inside the maintenance report, the town's groundskeeper at the time had made a chilling note. He wrote, "Vault 2 sealed, lock mechanism removed, recommend no further entry, stonework compromised, air foul. Something is still moving inside." It was written off by officials as superstition, a tired man scribbling strange thoughts after a long night's work. But Martin believed the man had seen something, or at least heard something. And if so, it meant those vaults might not have been entirely empty. The Jensen family was made aware of the theory, though they never responded publicly. By that point, Marla's case was already slipping further from memory. No new leads had emerged. The cemetery had quieted. But for some, especially those who kept Martin's files printed and marked up in binders, the Darnell vaults became an obsession. 18 years would pass before the ground shifted again, quite literally. And when it did, the people who remembered Martin Keene's warnings would think back to that letter, to the vault marked number 2, and to what someone had written in a shaky pen, "Something is still moving inside." In 2012, nearly 5 years after Marla Jensen vanished behind the cemetery gates, her name surfaced again, not through official channels, but in the background of a small-town true crime podcast. The show was hosted by two amateur sleuths who mostly covered forgotten cases across the Midwest. That week's episode focused on strange disappearances in Indiana, and Marla's story was one of the cold cases they discussed briefly. They recapped the basic facts: the shortcut through Whitaker Cemetery, the dog alert at the crypt, the absence of any physical evidence. What they didn't expect was the email that came in the next day. It was from a woman named Erica, who said she hadn't spoken about what happened in years. In her message, she explained that on the night Marla went missing, October 14, 2007, she and her friend Kelsey had snuck out and gone into Whitaker Cemetery around midnight. They were 15 at the time, walking with flashlights, curious more than anything. It had become a local thrill among teens to dare each other into the graveyard, especially near the old crypts. They didn't know Marla had vanished yet. That wouldn't hit the town until the next morning. According to Erica, they hadn't made it very far when they both froze. From the direction of the far crypts, the ones closest to the tree line, they heard something that didn't fit. Not animal sounds, not wind, but what she described as a girl's scream, panicked, short, like someone trying to yell through something. Kelsey had begged her to leave, and they ran out the way they came. They didn't tell anyone, not parents, not teachers. They assumed it was just their imaginations or someone playing a prank. It wasn't until the flyers went up later that day, Marla's face on every pole in town, that they realized what the timing might mean. But by then, they were afraid to say anything. The podcast hosts forwarded the email to the county sheriff's office, and for the first time in almost 4 years, the case file was reopened. Detectives tracked down both Erica and Kelsey, now in their early 20s and living out of state. In separate interviews, they recounted the same basic memory: sneaking into the cemetery, hearing the scream, running out. They admitted they couldn't tell where exactly it had come from, just that it was near the last row of crypts, the ones closest to the northwest rise. When pressed, they couldn't explain why they'd never come forward sooner. Shame, mostly, and fear of not being believed. The sheriff's office treated the new information as credible, but limited. The girl's memory, though sincere, couldn't be confirmed. There was no timestamp, no physical evidence, no witness beyond themselves. Still, it added a chilling layer to the night's timeline. Until then, the last confirmed sighting had been around 10:15 p.m. when a neighbor saw Marla walk through the gates. If Erica and Kelsey heard screams shortly after midnight, that meant Marla could have been alive and possibly held somewhere for nearly 2 hours after she disappeared. Search teams returned to the site once again, retracing every crypt and burial chamber in the northwest section. Ground-penetrating radar was briefly considered, but ultimately denied due to budget restrictions. A few local volunteers offered to fund private equipment, but the city blocked all independent access, citing liability and preservation laws. By the end of the month, the search was called off again. Nothing had been found, no new trace, no remains. The file, once again, drifted back into storage. News outlets covered the resurgence for a week or two. Old headlines were reprinted with updated timelines. But as the leads went nowhere, the attention faded. For the Jensen family, it was another cruel wave of almost answers, enough to stir the ache, but not enough to bring closure. Marla's mother, now in her late 50s, had suffered a stroke in 2011. She no longer gave interviews. Her speech was limited, and she rarely left the house. When reporters came to her door that spring, she refused to speak. Her sister answered instead, saying simply, "She can't go through this again." The town, meanwhile, was left unsettled. The cemetery had always been tied to the story, but now there was a timestamp: midnight, a scream, and 2 girls who for 5 years had carried that sound in silence. In private forums, the speculation reignited. Some claimed Marla had been trapped. Others suggested she was being held in one of the crypts all along. A few argued that someone had been watching the cemetery that night, someone who knew its layout too well. But again, there was no proof. Just a growing sense that something was missed, that something or someone had been waiting in the dark. And years later, when the crypt walls would finally be opened, that scream would return, not as memory, but as evidence that someone had heard her. and no one came. In March of 2014, 7 years after Marla Jensen walked through the gates of Whitaker Cemetery and disappeared, the groundskeeper made a call to the sheriff's office that reopened old fears in a town that had tried to forget. He had arrived early that morning to begin routine clearing of dead branches and overgrown weeds after the thaw. As he moved past the northwest section, the same cluster of crypts that had been searched countless times, he noticed something off. The metal gate of Crypt No. 3, which had been rusted shut and sealed by police back in 2007, now hung slightly ajar. There were no boot prints, no signs of forced entry in the usual sense. The chain that once wrapped around the handles had been carefully unwound and laid on the ground. The lock was missing, not broken, gone entirely. When the groundskeeper stepped inside, he didn't see anything at first, but he remembered the smell. Not the usual must of moss and stone, but something sharper, wet, sour, like old rot. And on the stone floor just inside the threshold, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Scratches. Not markings from animals or the elements, but what looked like clawed scrapes, deliberate and arched, digging into the limestone. He backed out, locked the gate with a spare, and called it in. The responding deputy remembered the place. He had been there back in 2007 when the search team swept through. Back then, the crypt had already been considered unstable. Cracked shelves, broken seals on the niches, old burial logs that went back nearly 100 years. It was one of several structures recommended for permanent closure. Still, it had been searched, cleared, and sealed with a metal gate and police padlock. There had never been a reason to revisit it, until now. When the officers arrived, they reopened the gate and entered cautiously. Inside, the air was heavier than expected, thick with humidity despite the cold outside. The back shelves had partially collapsed since the last visit, and sections of the ceiling showed new water damage. But no recent activity. No evidence of intrusion. The floor was scattered with bits of rock, crumbled plaster, and dead insects. One deputy took note of the scratches, photographing them in case they were part of a larger pattern. But no footprints were found, no tools, no graffiti or symbols, not even the usual signs of bored teenagers or vandals. Whoever entered had done so carefully, quietly, and had left just as silently. Forensics wasn't dispatched. The incident didn't escalate. The report was filed as unknown disturbance, no criminal findings. By the end of the week, the city ordered the crypt resealed, welded this time, with a metal plate bolted across the front gate and a warning notice posted, "No entry, structural hazard." But the scratches stayed in people's minds. So did the smell. News of the breach didn't make the front page, but word got around. Local forums lit up again with speculation, especially among the people who had followed Marla's case for years. Some believed it was a prank. Others believed someone had gone back looking for her, or what was left of her. One post, written anonymously, suggested something darker. That the crypt had been opened from the inside. Theories like that didn't hold much weight with law enforcement, but to those who still walked the cemetery paths, especially at dusk, something about Crypt No. 3 felt different now. Even older groundskeepers, men who didn't scare easily, began trimming back the trail a little farther each week, keeping more distance between their carts and the sealed gate. One detail never made it into the report. The groundskeeper, when asked again about what he saw, mentioned something small he hadn't thought to include earlier, a tiny ring of soot, no bigger than a dinner plate, at the back of the crypt near the broken shelf. He assumed it was mold. Maybe fire damage from decades ago. But when investigators reviewed the old records, they found no reports of any fire in that section of the cemetery after 1935. The scorch marks, if that's what they were, didn't match any known incident. By summer, interest had faded again. The gate stayed sealed. The crypt stood silent. But those scratches stayed in the stone, and those who believed Marla had never left the cemetery were now more certain than ever that something had stirred in the place they'd all stopped looking. And when a boy with a drone flew over that same crypt nearly a decade later and noticed the ground shifting behind it, everything that had once been dismissed as imagination would demand to be re-examined, this time from beneath the surface. In May of 2025, a 13-year-old boy named Cole Jennings took his drone out to Whitaker Cemetery as part of a school history project. He'd recently gotten the drone for his birthday, and he was more interested in getting cool aerial shots than writing about local gravestone inscriptions. His teacher had given him permission to focus on the cemetery's architecture, and with permission from the groundskeeper, he launched the drone from the parking lot, letting it rise above the tree line before sweeping slowly across the overgrown hills and clustered crypts. He flew it twice, once in the morning and once again in the late afternoon, when the light hit everything in deeper contrast. He didn't notice anything unusual while flying. The footage just looked old and gray, like everything down there had been asleep for decades. It wasn't until later that night, while reviewing clips for his video edit, that something caught his eye. He paused a frame near the end of his second flight. Behind one of the crypts, crypt number 3, though he didn't know it by name, the ground looked sunken. Not in an obvious way, but in the afternoon light, the shadows revealed a dip in the terrain that hadn't been there in the morning footage. It looked like a shallow, narrow sinkhole had formed, just inches from the crypt's rear wall. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but when he zoomed in, he saw broken roots, scattered rock, and what looked like old bricks exposed beneath the soil. He showed it to his dad, who happened to be on the town's planning commission. Within 2 days, the cemetery board was notified, and a small maintenance crew was dispatched to assess the erosion. It wasn't the first time sinkholes had formed in the area. The cemetery sat on layers of limestone and aging infrastructure, but the proximity to the crypt made it unusual. What the crew didn't expect was how deep the hollow ran. When they removed the loose soil around the collapse, they found not just erosion, but a small cavity pressed against the rear foundation of the crypt, and embedded in the dirt wall of that cavity, beneath cracked stone and tangled roots, was a single bricked-over shaft, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The bricks were old, not modern cement blocks, but hand-laid red clay, some marked with soot. The shaft itself had been sealed deliberately, tight, uneven layers of mortar smeared across every seam. There was no structural record of any shaft or crawl space at that location. When the head groundskeeper contacted the city's historical department, they found no documentation in the cemetery's blueprints, no air vents, no maintenance channels, nothing that should have led there. And yet, the shaft was real. Within a week, a forensic archaeology team was brought in under limited supervision. The bricked wall was carefully removed in sections, and behind it, tucked into the hillside behind crypt number 3, they found what looked like a chamber carved directly into the limestone, about 7 feet long and 4 feet tall. Barely large enough to crouch in, and at the far end of that space, set into the stone like it didn't belong there at all, was a makeshift metal door. Welded, bolted, and shut from the outside. It looked handmade, not part of any official structure. Steel sheets cut unevenly, riveted together, scorched in places. The welding around the seams was rough, as if done in a hurry or by someone without formal training. There were no markings on the door, no lock, no handle. Just solid weight pressing inward. Whoever sealed it had done so to keep something in, not out. The team stepped back. The site was immediately flagged for further forensic investigation. Soil samples were taken. The chamber was scanned. A larger perimeter was marked off to preserve evidence in case a crime scene was declared, and all excavation ceased until proper warrants could be filed. That night, news leaked. A Reddit post went viral showing drone stills of the sinkhole, along with speculation about the hidden chamber. People who had followed Marla Jensen's case for years reappeared in the comment sections. Crypt No. 3 had long been the subject of online theories. The site of the cadaver dog alert, the strange scratches, the report of a foul smell in 2014. Now there was a door behind it, a door no one knew existed, a door no one could explain. Within 48 hours, local authorities secured the area and requested forensic pathologists from the state. The door was still sealed. No one knew what was behind it yet. But the tension was immediate, quiet, heavy, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the question no one could shake wasn't if Marla had ever left the cemetery, but if she had ever been allowed to. The morning the chamber was unsealed, the cemetery was already lined with news vans. Reporters stood by in hushed voices, careful not to cross the perimeter tape stretched along the slope behind Crypt No. 3. Drone footage from the previous week had ignited online speculation into full-blown obsession. Comment threads dissected every frame, every shadow. People wanted answers. Police, for once, thought they might have them. By noon, the steel door embedded in the stone was cleared, documented, and photographed. A forensic team from Indianapolis stood ready in full suits. They'd brought thermal scanners, trace analysis kits, and 2 cadaver dogs. What they didn't bring was expectation. No one said it out loud, but everyone assumed the chamber would be empty. Forgotten history. Another dead lead. When they cut through the welds and unbolted the final seal, the metal creaked inward with resistance. The door opened only halfway before it caught against debris, what looked like fabric and rusted metal just inside. A technician reached in with a camera on a boom arm and slowly turned the light toward the interior. It wasn't a tunnel. It wasn't a vault. It was a room, no wider than 6 feet, with walls carved roughly from limestone and sealed in what appeared to be old roofing tar. The floor was cracked concrete, partly caved at one corner. Against the right-hand wall were 2 rusted folding chairs, one tipped over, the other still upright. Nearby were 2 mold-covered wool blankets, faded and stiff, half buried in a layer of dust and mouse droppings. The air inside was foul, damp, thin. One of the investigators described it later as thick with forgotten time. Along the back wall, chains were bolted directly into the stone, 3 of them, each no longer than 4 feet, ending in iron cuffs. They were arranged at slight intervals, enough for someone to sit but not to stand. The cuffs were worn. Inside one, embedded with rust, was what looked like a single human hair. But what stopped everyone cold was what lay crumpled in the corner beneath the far edge of the broken ceiling. A human skeleton curled on its side, partially covered by rotted clothing. The arms were pulled in tightly, the knees drawn to the chest, the skull angled toward the wall as if trying to look away. The fingers, still attached to bone, were curled against the stone floor. For a moment, no one spoke. A quiet alert went up. The lead forensic agent entered, knelt carefully, and reached into the debris near the body. Just beneath a collapsed section of fabric, they found something plastic, faded but intact. It was a school ID card, the type issued by the local high school in the early 2000s. The edges were worn, the surface was cloudy, but the name and photo were still visible beneath the dirt. The name read, Marla Jensen. Everything stopped after that. The chamber was declared a crime scene. The body wasn't touched for several hours. Every inch of the space was photographed, measured, and documented before removal. Soil samples were taken from the base of the chains, the corners of the room, and the debris pile near the entrance. Initial temperature and humidity readings confirmed the space had likely been sealed for over a decade. There were no power lines, no light fixtures, no food containers newer than 2009. An autopsy would later confirm that the remains were consistent with a female between 16 and 18 years old, height and bone structure matching Marla's medical records. Though full identification would take weeks, the ID card was considered enough to notify the family. Her mother, still recovering from a second stroke, was informed through a family liaison. She didn't speak. Her sister, in tears, told reporters only one thing: "I knew she never ran." Inside the chamber, investigators found no bedding beyond the blankets, no writing, no messages carved into the walls. Only one item stood out, a small plastic wristwatch, its face cracked, resting near the skeletal remains. The time on it was frozen at 12:47. No one could confirm if that was a real indicator of when it stopped, or if it had simply broken years ago. Forensic artists began reconstructing the sequence, the chains, the sealed entrance, the absence of airflow or sunlight. There were no signs of gunshot wounds or sharp trauma, but there were indications of long-term malnutrition. The bones showed signs of atrophy. Hints of healed fractures, possibly rib damage. The cause of death wasn't immediate, likely infection, dehydration, or untreated illness. It had been nearly 18 years. And now, with her body discovered in a space no one had known existed, behind a crypt that had been searched and sealed, one question returned louder than any other. Who put her there, and how had they kept it hidden so long? Because while the chamber had just been discovered, someone had once welded that door shut from the outside, and the chains told investigators what they feared most. Marla hadn't died the night she disappeared. She had lived for days, maybe longer, and somewhere in those walls, someone had heard her, maybe even watched her. The answers weren't far now. They were waiting, just one level deeper. The discovery of Marla Jensen's remains inside the hidden chamber was enough to shock investigators, but it was what they found next that unsettled them most. Once the body was carefully removed and the space was fully documented, forensic experts began their slow inspection of the limestone walls. At first, the surface seemed unremarkable. Cracked stone with patches of moisture and moss growth, nothing unusual for a space sealed nearly 2 decades. But under stronger light, faint marks began to emerge. Long scratches cut into the limestone, shallow but deliberate, clustered near the chains bolted into the back wall. Some were random scrapes, desperate claw marks. Others were clearer. Words. The first message, written unevenly, repeated in shaky letters, was the word help. Another, further down, spelled out no light. The letters were jagged, carved with something blunt, perhaps a nail or a shard of metal. Their uneven depth suggested someone had pressed until the tool snapped or dulled. These weren't idle scratches. They were last attempts, messages meant for someone, anyone, who might one day open the door. But not all of the writing was obvious. A technician wiping the lower corner of the wall uncovered something even stranger. Hidden beneath a layer of grime, etched faintly into the surface, were 2 initials, R.J. They weren't random, they weren't decorations, they were carved clearly enough to stand apart from the rest. Investigators cross-referenced the initials almost immediately. Within hours, local school records provided the connection. R.J. matched one name in particular, Ryan Jeffers, a 16-year-old student who had gone missing just 2 weeks after Marla. His disappearance back in 2007 hadn't gained the same coverage. He was last seen leaving football practice on a rainy evening, never making it home. At the time, police considered him a runaway, noting trouble at school and tension with his father. His case had been logged, but no one had linked it to Marla's. Different circumstances, different assumptions. Now, standing inside a chamber where Marla had been chained, investigators stared at those 2 letters carved into the wall and realized the cases had never been separate. Ryan Jeffers had been here too, but his body wasn't. The chamber contained only one set of remains. Marla's ID, Marla's clothing, Marla's desperate scratches, no trace of Ryan's bones, his belongings, or his signature, only the initials. That meant one of 2 things. Either he had never died there, or his body had been moved. The team expanded their search. Near the corner of the chamber, partially obscured by crumbled debris, they found what looked like a vent shaft. At first glance, it was no more than a rusted duct pipe about 6 inches wide, built into the stone and leading upward. But closer inspection revealed it didn't vent to the surface. Instead, it ran laterally, disappearing deeper into the hillside. When they tapped the shaft, it echoed faintly, hollow, as if connecting to another space beyond. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed again, this time directed behind the Crypt cluster. The scans showed voids, multiple irregular hollows, spreading beneath the northwest slope. They weren't natural formations. They were chambers. Some collapsed, some sealed, some still intact. The old maps from the 1930s, the ones local historian Martin Keene had uncovered years earlier, suddenly took on new weight. The bricked-over vaults, the ones listed as permanently inaccessible, appeared to still exist. And this duct suggested they had been connected. The revelation shifted the investigation into new territory. For the first time, authorities admitted they were no longer looking at a single abduction or a runaway. They were standing on top of a concealed network of spaces deliberately altered, hidden, and possibly used long after they were thought abandoned. Marla had been one victim. Ryan Jeffers might have been another. Detectives dug back into Ryan's file. His last known location was nearly 3 miles away, across town. His backpack was found discarded near a drainage ditch weeks later, but no evidence tied it to foul play. His father had moved out of state after years of frustration, convinced his son had left by choice. Now, confronted with the initials in the crypt wall, even he admitted something darker might have happened. For the public, The news was devastating. 2 missing teens, same year, same town, same cemetery. One was found dead, one still unaccounted for. Online forums swelled with speculation. Some argued Ryan had been held in the same chamber but moved later. Others suggested he had escaped through the duct, that maybe he had gotten out, leaving his initials behind as proof. But if he had survived, why hadn't he come forward? And if he hadn't, where was he now? Investigators decided the duct had to be explored. Engineers were brought in to stabilize the ground before attempting entry. It would take weeks of careful excavation, but everyone knew what was at stake. Whatever was hidden below those sealed subvaults wasn't just history. It was evidence. It was a continuation of the story that had begun the night Marla disappeared. And for the first time in 18 years, it wasn't just Marla's voice echoing from the crypt walls. Another name had joined hers, scratched in desperation: RJ. 2 letters that suggested she hadn't been alone. And somewhere in the dark beneath Whitaker Cemetery, Ryan Jeffers' story was waiting to be told. When investigators widened the search around crypt number 3, the narrow duct that vanished into the hillside became their focus. At first, engineers tried to send cameras through, but the pipe was too corroded and clogged with debris. So excavation crews began carefully removing soil, exposing more of the duct until they reached a break in the stone. What they uncovered was not natural. It was a tunnel, hand-cut, narrow, and long since collapsed in several sections. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what historian Martin Keene had suggested years earlier. The old Darnell crypts had once been connected by underground passages. Some had caved in, but others remained sealed beneath layers of soil and cement. For investigators, it was a chilling validation. These weren't just burial vaults. Someone had used them. Over the course of 2 weeks, teams worked in shifts, reinforcing the fragile stone and removing rubble. The duct eventually led them downward into a larger chamber. Unlike the rough limestone crawlspace where Marla's body had been found, this one had been deliberately altered. The walls were smoother, lined with poured concrete that looked like the mid-20th century. A modern reinforcement suggesting someone had accessed and modified it long after the cemetery's early days. A steel support beam jutted from the ceiling. The floor was level, swept of loose debris. It wasn't a tomb, it was a room, and someone had lived here. On the left side were remnants of a cot frame and a decayed mattress. In the corner sat a stack of rusted folding chairs, identical to those in the first chamber. Empty food cans were scattered across the floor, labels faded but still legible. Many were stamped with dates from 2007 through 2009. Some had been neatly opened with a can opener, others bent and pried open roughly. Against the far wall stood a small crate containing glass jars, once filled with water, now evaporated and clouded. There were signs of long-term human presence: cigarette butts, scraps of cloth, a broken lantern, even a rusted portable stove. But the most disturbing discoveries were on a makeshift desk fashioned from 2 cinder blocks and a wooden board. There lay several small notebooks, their pages curled from damp but still intact. The handwriting was erratic, looping in places, angry in others. The entries were fragmented, often rambling, but investigators quickly realized what they were. Journals. They described daily routines, thoughts, and distorted justifications from whoever had built and maintained the chambers. One passage read, "The girl does not speak anymore. She watches the wall. Purification takes time." Another mentioned a boy, referred to only as R, and how he fought too hard, broke the light. The journals were enough to confirm what investigators feared. This was not a random collapse or forgotten chamber. It was a deliberately constructed holding place. Someone had lived here, someone had kept captives here, and someone had recorded their own twisted version of events. Forensics swept the space meticulously. Multiple strands of hair were recovered from the bedding and corners. DNA testing identified one as belonging to Ryan Jeffers. The initials RJ carved in Marla's chamber were no longer speculation. Ryan had been here too. Whether he had died in this place or escaped remained unclear, but his presence was undeniable. The journals confirmed that he had survived at least for a time inside these walls. The room was heavy with evidence of life, yet there was nobody. No bones, no clear sign of where Ryan had gone. The emptiness suggested either removal or escape, but without remains, there was no conclusion. Then came the final discovery. Near the reinforced wall, tacked into the concrete with a rusted nail, was a photograph. A single print, slightly water-stained, curling at the edges but still visible. It showed Marla, not as she had been found, but alive, sitting against a wall, her hair limp, her skin pale, eyes unfocused. A blanket was draped over her shoulders. Her expression was blank, not fear, not peace, but absence. Someone had taken the picture while she was captive. Someone had pinned it to the wall and left it there, preserved like a trophy. The image shook the entire investigation. For years, Marla had been treated as a disappearance, a single night of terror that ended in silence. The photograph proved otherwise. She had lived beyond that night, trapped underground, seen by someone who documented her condition. The journals, the food cans, the strands of hair, all pointed to years of occupation. But the photograph was personal. It wasn't a record for survival. It was something meant to be kept, looked at, remembered. When investigators emerged from the chamber, carrying that photograph sealed in plastic, the atmosphere outside shifted. For the first time, the public understood the scale of what lay beneath Whitaker Cemetery. It wasn't just where Marla had vanished, it was where she had been kept, where Ryan had been held, and where someone had built a secret life in the dark. And if there were more tunnels, more chambers, then the question became unavoidable. What else had been hidden all these years? Just beneath their feet. The evidence pulled from the underground room was unlike anything investigators had encountered before. The preserved food cans, the rusted stove, the erratic journals, all pointed to a person who had not only lived beneath Whitaker Cemetery, but had shaped it into a prison. Forensic analysis traced the origin of several items. The folding chairs had once been purchased in bulk by the cemetery's maintenance office. The lanterns matched a discontinued brand used locally until the mid-1990s, and the steel plating used on the welded door was identical to scrap material ordered by a single employee in 2006. That man was Walter Darnell. Walter had been the cemetery's caretaker for over 3 decades, a quiet figure who kept to himself. He lived in a small house at the cemetery's edge, near the service road that most townspeople rarely drove down. Records showed he was a descendant of the Darnell family, the same landowners who had established the original burial plots in the late 1800s. Though many of his relatives had long since moved away, Walter remained, maintaining the grounds, opening and closing gates, and handling burials. Neighbors described him as reclusive but polite. He drank alone, avoided crowds, and never married. His disappearance in 2010 had been noted briefly in the local paper, but by then, he was just another old man who had slipped out of view. No one looked deeper. The journals pulled from the chamber revealed the disturbing reality. Page after page showed a fragmented mind unraveling. He wrote of purifying the lost, of rebuilding the family line beneath the stone, and of returning them to silence. Entries mentioned Marla directly, describing her early days underground, her refusal to eat, her eventual compliance, and her silence. One passage dated late 2008 read, "The girl sits in the dark now, no longer asking. She is learning what the light took away." Another, in 2009, noted, "The boy fought. He broke the lamp. He won't return." The gates are sealed. That boy was Ryan Jeffers. His DNA found in the chamber matched the journal's claims. He had been held underground but had somehow escaped. The details of his fate remain unknown, but Darnell's writing made one thing clear. After Ryan's disappearance, Walter no longer trusted his captives. Marla, according to the journals, lived for nearly 6 years in captivity. He wrote of illness, of her body weakening, of her voice fading. In a 2013 entry, the handwriting grew erratic, almost illegible. "She won't rise anymore. The air is clean without her sound." That was likely the year she died, alone in the chamber, sealed away while life continued above. Walter disappeared less than a year later. His truck was found abandoned outside town, his home stripped bare. At the time, no one connected his absence to the cemetery's mysteries. Now, with the discovery of the chambers, his role could no longer be denied. The final detail unearthed by investigators was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Behind the rear wall of Crypt number 3, hidden behind loose stone, they found a small carved passage leading upward, a surveillance hole no wider than a fist, cut into the mortar and aimed directly toward the cemetery grounds above. Through it, Walter Darnell had been able to watch mourners as they stood at headstones, to observe funerals, to see people laying flowers just feet above where his captives were chained. He hadn't just hidden in the cemetery. He had lived within it, moving in silence beneath the mourners who never realized he was there. The discovery left investigators shaken. It wasn't just the horror of what he had done, but the proximity. He hadn't buried his victims miles away in the woods. He had kept them directly under the town's feet, in plain sight, hidden behind walls everyone assumed were sealed for good. For the Jensen family, the confirmation of Marla's suffering was devastating. They held a second burial, laying her to rest properly this time, with her classmates, now grown adults, standing beside her mother and aunt. The ceremony was quiet, grief-stricken, but final. The state ordered the demolition of Crypt number 3 and the surrounding vaults. What remained of the tunnels was collapsed and filled. The cemetery board vowed never to allow the ground to be used again. But the scars lingered. For every investigator who worked the case, the part that haunted them most wasn't the chains or the journals. It wasn't even the photograph pinned to the wall. It was that small surveillance hole, a reminder that Walter Darnell had been watching all along, eyes fixed on the living while keeping his victims in silence just below. The crypt was gone. The truth was uncovered. But for those who stood at Whitaker Cemetery after the demolition, one thought was impossible to shake. Marla Jensen had never really vanished behind the gates. She had been there the entire time.